Okay, I got a question for you guys. How many of you guys, when you were a kid, you got lost? Yeah, a lot of people. Maybe you weren't actually lost, but you couldn't see or hear your parents for a brief moment. And as a kid, you couldn't understand the concept that just because you couldn't see or hear your parents, that they didn't leave you forever or abandon you for good. I remember I was in the first grade, and I was hanging out at a neighbor's house, and my parents took my sisters to go look at model homes because we were thinking about moving. Well, as I was at my friend's house, he decides to pop off to his parents and get in trouble, which is the most uncomfortable feeling of being at a friend's house and they get in trouble, because you feel like you're in trouble. And so he has to go to timeout, and they say, sorry, Chase, he can't hang out anymore. So I had to go home. But no one told young Chase that his family wasn't at the house anymore. So I go home, it's around dusk, and none of the house lights are on. And I knock on the door, and the door's locked too. And I don't want to go back to my friend's house because that was awkward. So I just sit there. And then the thoughts start to creep in. Did my family leave me forever? Did they abandon me? I don't know where they are. They've left me for good. And it was only 15 to 20 minutes, but for a first grader, that felt like a lifetime. And other than that being a really traumatic childhood story that I tell you guys, I feel like we can be like that in our spiritual life. Where if we don't hear God, or if we don't see Him moving, those questions start to creep in. Of God, where are you? God, I haven't heard from you in a long time. God, I don't see you moving in my life. And we feel like that lost child. Christmas Day is approaching, and we're so excited for it. I mean, we got 2 more days, and there's so much hype for it. People, you might be excited because you really want to give that gift to your family member or your friend, or you really want to get a gift. Maybe you have a Christmas tradition that you just can't wait to do, or you just want to eat the really good food. There is so much hype going towards Christmas. We've got a song called the 12 Days of Christmas, which none of you guys know because the lyrics are so difficult. But we can't wait for Christmas. But if we rewind to the actual first Christmas, the day that Jesus was born, there isn't this eager excitement. They're waiting, but it's a different kind of waiting. Because for them, it's been 400 years where God hasn't said anything, where they feel like God has been silent. They haven't seen God moving in their lives. So for them, it was just a normal day. Because about 4 to 5 centuries before, you have Israel coming back from captivity, coming back from Babylon and going back to Jerusalem. And there they would accomplish the task of rebuilding the temple. They would teach the Torah, and they would build the wall. And the young people are so excited that they do all of these things, but the elders, they're weeping because they knew in the glory days that Jerusalem looked so different. Because they did all these things, but they really didn't solve anything. Because when they rebuilt the temple, God's presence wasn't there anymore. When they taught the Torah, no one was following the law. And when they built the wall wasn't supposed to be built in the first place because the temple was meant for all nations and not just one. So we're left with this awkward tension at the end of the Old Testament where things aren't really finished. And then you have the book of Malachi, which was written around the same period. And Malachi is a prophet, and he's telling all the people to go back to God. He says that there's going to be a Messiah who's going to bring justice and restoration. And they're really excited for all this. And then it's silence for 400 years. And I wonder how patient the Israel nation was. Maybe 40 to 50 years. Maybe a few generations. But then the thoughts started to creep in. God, where are you? God, you have so many promises to us. God, you promised us a messianic king. God, you promised us your presence in the temple. God, you promised us that your kingdom will be over all the nations. And for 400 years, there's silence. There's nothing. It feels like God is distant. It feels like he's absent. And I feel like we can relate to the Israel nation. For us, it might not be 400 years, but you can't remember the last time that you heard from God or saw him moving in your life. There's a Spanish poet and mystic, St. John the Cross. He wrote this poem called The Dark Night of the Soul. And the dark night of the soul is referring to when a believer is going through this period where they're surrounded by darkness. They don't see the light. They don't hear from God. They don't see God, and they feel like they're in this dark night of the soul. And for most of us, if not all of us who have been believers for a long enough time, we've gone through these dark nights where we don't hear God. We don't see him moving. Maybe you're thinking about going to college, and you want God to be involved in all areas of your life. So you pray, God, where should I go to college? And you hear nothing. Or maybe a family member is diagnosed with cancer, and you're praying constantly for God to take that away, but you don't see him moving. Or maybe life isn't chaotic. Maybe life is going relatively well, except for your spiritual life. Because when you pray, you hear nothing. When you read your Bible, you get nothing out of it. When you sing these worship songs, there's no emotions that are connected to it. And you feel like that lost child. The thoughts start to creep in. God, where are you? God, you seem distant. God, you seem absent. Today we're going to be going through a psalm where David is pleading before God and saying, God, it seems like you're hiding your face from me. God, where are you? And he's kept up all night with these thoughts. He feels like his enemies are going to overtake him, so we are not the only ones who go through this dark night of soul. We even have the king of Israel feeling the same exact way. So today we're going to be going through 3 different steps on how we approach God when he feels like he's silent and absent. So turn to Psalm 13, and as you're doing that, Natalie's just going to be talking about the first step.
I think it's really important what Chase shared with us, just to even hear someone on a stage saying, like, I've been through that dark night of the soul, that silence or waiting on God where you felt like he was distant. Because I think as believers, it's one of the most isolating factors that we sometimes come to faith through very emotional, together, community-driven moments at camps or at a retreat, or just having a really great time within the community where you feel the love of God, and on an emotional high, we make this decision to pursue God, and we feel so pursued by him in that time. And then comes this silence or this waiting or a lack of all of that emotion and all of God speaking, all of these aha moments, and suddenly it becomes super isolating. We assume that everyone else is still super hyped and we're the only ones that are feeling this right now. But even to have someone on a stage to say, hey, I've done this before, I've been through this before, how many of you just felt a little bit of a sigh of a relief because you weren't the only one? And then to know that everyone else in this audience next to you is also breathing that same sigh of relief, that it's not actually nearly as isolating as it feels, but it's actually something that identifies us with each other, that it's something we've all walked through, and it shouldn't be this thing to separate us from God or separate us from our community, but instead be something that we lean into. So I think the first thing that we lean into that is to be honest. We see that in Psalm 13. This is a psalm of David who had so many highs and lows. If he was someone who was called to have a heart after God, if it's something that we aspire to have, maybe not aspire to make the life choices that David made, but if we want to follow one thing that he did do well in his life, it was to worship God with sincerity, that he spoke honestly to God, and he also heard honestly from God. So Psalm 13 says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" The beginning of his prayer there is just complete honesty. That feeling of, this is the most exhausting thing I've ever done, to have to continually come back to you, God, and feel like I'm getting nothing back, or to feel like my enemies are winning over me. Sometimes we have this fear, I think, that if we were that honest with God, that one, we'd be like smited, the lightning would come down, and we would be gone forever. I mean, if I were God, maybe that's how it would work. Like, don't talk back to me, you're dead. But that's not how God works. Good thing I'm not God. Yeah. Or the other side of it is, I just don't want to deal with it. It's too painful. It's way better if I pretend I don't feel that way, and I just move on to some other emotion that I like better, or something that distracts me from this. But we don't see the health that comes from David without that honest conversation with God. And I think as Christians, a big part of growing in Christ is learning to be a child. We want this relationship to be like two equals. Like, okay, God, you move one way, and I'm going to respond in kind. So if you start to ice me out and give me the silent treatment, which is what it feels like in those moments, then our next option, our response is just to ice him out. Okay, God, well, if you're not going to talk to me, I'm not going to talk to you. First of all, how immature is that? But second, that's not how a child treats their parent. I know from example, because I have a 6-year-old who does not have any filter when it comes to me. And so this week she was playing at home, and they were having a great time playing make-believe, whatever. They were in their own little world, and it was great. But we were moments away from that moment where someone gets hurt or something's broken or there's a fight breaks out. And I was like, it's just going to be a mess in here. Everyone's going to be freaking out. I'm going to take her out to the store. It'll be a girls' trip. So I was like, come on, let's go to the store. And she, in her world, I just ripped her out of make-believe land. That was perfect, and everything was great about it. And so the whole car ride to the store, she first of all, she walked about this quickly towards the car, like 2 inches at a time, and I was like, I have to go. So she protested the entire time, and at the store, she's going, this is the worst day ever. You ruined my day. I was just trying to have a nice time, and you ruined my time. All these things coming out of a 6-year-old's mouth. But her honesty didn't affect my power. It didn't threaten me. It didn't belittle me. I still knew who I was. I was aware that there was more to the situation than she was seeing. But I think her honesty is what we need to learn to be like in being children of God, that we need to be honest with God as our Father. I think a great example of that conversation between a father and a child is in Job 30. If you know anything about Job, he was, quick story or a synopsis of the story. He had all of this wealth, all these riches, and all these blessings, and the enemy came to God and said, hey, the only reason that Job praises you is because you've set up his life so well. If he wasn't so comfortable, he wouldn't praise you. He would curse you. And so God allows this to happen to prove Job's faithfulness to him, that his children are killed, his wealth is taken away, and all through it, he's staying pretty consistent and solid and still praising God. But then there comes a moment where he just loses it, like a 6-year-old who just got ripped out of their world that was so good, that he starts complaining about God and even starts to see it as God tormenting him. So if you are in Job, it's chapter 30, verse 16, he says, and now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken over me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about by the collar of my tunic. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. Specifically, these are words that Joby said to me. You don't even care that you're ruining my life. She's like, you have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. His perspective of worshiping God has just turned so far to, God, I know that you're just trying to ruin my life. You don't even care about me, and you're the purpose of all of this pain in my life. And the thing about an honest conversation between a parent and a child is it doesn't break the relationship between good parents. It doesn't end it. Their love is not contingent on you being respectful all of the time, but on honesty, that he allows him to have his moment. And then if you jump over a few chapters to Job 40, this is God's big talking to that he gives to Job, and it's one of my favorite passages. You all know that mom voice that your mom has that's like a decibel that you could hear in a windstorm. I think they get it from God. This is where he says it. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, dress for action like a man. My Bible has the polite version, but other ones might say gird your loins or dress like a man. Cover your sensitive bits is what he's saying. I'm going to come at you. I have a question for you, and you will make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be put in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? You think about when you told your mom you really wanted something, and she said no, and you said, why not? She's like, did you pay for this house? Did you buy those clothes that you're wearing? Would you like to buy your clothes for the rest of your lives? And how many times you're like, yeah, Mom, I'll do it. But this is what she says. This is what God says. Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the wind below. Then I will acknowledge to you that you can have your own right hand to save you. That God has all the patience to receive his complaints and his whining and all of the things that we hold on to and feel like we don't have the permission to be honest with God about how painful our situation is or how uncomfortable we are. He lets him have it. He lets him say his bit, and then he says, okay, this is my answer to you. Did you create the world? Are you able to dress yourself with majesty and ensue justice on the entire world? That in that relationship, in our honesty, God can respond to a sincere heart. So that's my first point, is that you would come to God with honesty, complain to him, repetitively come back to him with the same complaints, and know that he's going to respond. And even in his discipline, it proves his love. If you guys want to circle for later, Hebrews 12:7, it says that the Lord disciplines those that he loves. That a parent wouldn't discipline someone else's children, but they do discipline their own children. So even in a season where you feel like God's putting you in your place, how reassuring is that we're actually his children, that he cares enough to put us in our place, to set us straight. And my second point under that is just to be honest with others. That if we all want church to be an honest place, if that's some people's biggest complaint about church is that we're not honest here, that it has to start with you, to make a commitment to be the one that is honest about it, to not be fine. I'm fine, it's fine, we're all fine. That's like a joke that we have, that fine is actually something much less than that. I like the movie, The Italian Job, they call it freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. But that's actually what we're saying when we're saying, I'm fine. It's all actually falling apart, and it's the worst. And I think we have another fear that, like, if I told people honestly how I felt, then I would be the person that's always complaining about, like, or disastrifying my entire life. So we go the other way and we say, it's fine, it's great, I'm so great. And the truth is, when we're honest about where we're at, then we give others the permission to be honest with where they're at. That isolated feeling that you felt before Chase even brought that up, it goes away when we start to acknowledge it and give others permission to acknowledge it themselves. And then we can lean in and act like the church and pray for each other, support each other, and remind each other of truths. And that leads us up to our next point.
The first point was to be honest with God. The second point for us to do when we feel like God is silent and distant is for us to depend on God, for us to rely on his answers and his truth. The psalm continues and says this, "Consider me and answer, Lord my God." David just finished being honest with God, saying, God, where are you? God, I don't feel like you're there. You're hiding your face from me. But the thing he does next is that he continues in prayer. He knows that it's God's answer that is going to bring him through the situation. I feel like our society, we pride ourselves on accomplishing tasks by our own strength. I mean, we're the ones who study so hard to get into the great schools. We're the ones who train over and over to make the team. We practice continually so we can get the solo at the concert. The American dream is you work hard so you can provide for yourself and for your family. But if you carry that into your spiritual life, it can be very dangerous. Because if you pray to God and you feel like you don't get an answer, well then, might as well just do it on your own. Take initiative. Pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps. Fix your own mess. But if this mindset is left unchecked, then you're going to completely shut out God. Because once you actually do accomplish something, then you're going to pride yourselves on your own accomplishments. Oh, I did this. Instead of thanking God for giving you the gifts to actually do it. We can't have this mindset of, I'm the one who's going to bring myself out of this situation. We can't let this go unchecked. If our prayers feel like they're going unheard, we're to keep praying. We're to keep searching. In Luke 11, Jesus has just taught disciples of what does it look like to pray. And immediately after, he tells them a story about how a man has a friend come from out of town. But this man doesn't have anything to give to his friend. So he goes to his neighbor's house, and he knocks on the door and says, please, may you loan me 3 loaves of bread. The neighbor says, look, it's 12 o'clock at night. I've put everything away. My family's in bed. Just go away. But this man is persistent, and he keeps knocking, and eventually This neighbor gives them loaves of bread. And so Jesus, he tells this story right after he teaches them how to pray because he wants to teach them to be persistent in prayer. He doesn't want them to just give up of, oh, I prayed this once and God's not listening, so I guess I got to do things on my own. He tells them, keep searching. To keep asking and it will be given to you. To keep seeking and you will find. To keep knocking and the door will be opened. But again, don't fall in the mindset of, oh, I have to be the one who's doing all the asking. I'm doing the seeking. I'm doing the knocking. I guess it's on my own power. But right afterwards, it says that God is the one who gives good gifts. He's the one who gives the bread, not the stone, not the snake. So we are to rely on his answers. Continue to go to him. Don't feel like you can do it on your own strength or your own wisdom, but depend on God. The psalm continues and it says this, restore brightness to my eyes, otherwise I will sleep in death. David notices that his situation around him is getting pretty dark, that he's not able to see things too clearly. He's making out objects, but he doesn't fully understand what they are. It's like if you were ever to walk into a room and you see an object and you feel like it's something like really bad. Like you never assume the best thing about it. Like you go into a room and you see something, you're like, that's a person, and they got a knife and they're gonna stab me. And you turn on the lights and it's just a chair. You're like, oh gosh. Or if you've ever been in this room and these lights turn off, you're thinking, oh great, all the demons that were in here are now escaped because of darkness and I have to sprint out. Just me? Okay. But whenever, or even you're downstairs and you have to turn on the lights and you run the fastest you can up the stairs because you think, haha, now everything that's scary is now just released because it's all dark. But in the darkness, we start to believe these lies. We start to believe that these terrible things are coming after us. We start to think that these things are so strong, but when we turn on the lights, we realize, oh, it's not that big of a deal. We realize, oh, that's not actually as scary as I thought it was. When you bring things into the light, the situations that you're going through, you're bringing it not into light where, oh, I'm bigger than that. But you bring it into light and you realize, oh, my God is bigger than that. Oh, my God is stronger than the situation I'm going through. Oh, my God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. My God is a good father and he loves me. But if you keep in the darkness, you think it's this terrible thing. Like I remember one time I was hanging out with my best friend at a park, and it was at nighttime, and we were talking about deep things, and so we weren't really paying attention to what was happening around us. And then we started hearing sounds come from the playgrounds, and eventually, we both acknowledged, and hey, did you hear that? We're like, oh, okay, we just keep talking. But the sounds grew louder and louder. And we started hearing the sound of something like metal against the metal pipes, and I was like, oh gosh. And then I saw an object move on the jungle gym, and I said, hey, Ryan, let's go back to your car. And then these objects started to move towards us with incredible speed. So we went from a fast walk to a sprint to his truck. And I was freaked out, and so I was sprinting there. We get into the car. He can't start the car, just like all good horror movies are. It's like, start the car. Okay, start the car. And I see these objects. They're now going really fast, and they're coming at me, and I'm thinking, I'm dead. These are people who are going to just destroy me. I don't know what's going to happen, but this was a fun life. And it was only until these objects came into the light that I realized it was two of my other friends. They found out that we were at the park, and they just wanted to spook us, and well, they did. But it's so many times where we leave our situations in the dark, and we feel like they have so much power over us. But when we bring it into the light, when we show it to God, and we see that God is bigger than all of it, we notice that he is stronger. It feels like our fears are alleviated. But don't belittle the situation. Don't feel like, oh, I'm fine. It's not that big of a deal. What I'm going through right now, I can deal with that. My friends are all making rumors about me. No, it's not that big. I'm good. My family member's getting sick. Yeah, I mean, that stinks, but I'm fine. If you belittle your situation, you belittle your God. If you make little of what you're going through, you make God to be, oh, well, I guess he can handle that situation. But if I were truly acknowledged for how much this sucks, I don't know if God can handle that. No, see your situation for fully what it is, but know your God is bigger. So the second step, when we feel like God is silent, when we feel like God is distant, is to rely on him. Depend on his strength. Go to him in prayer, not on your own strength. To rely on his truth, to rely on the light that he brings into our situations. And here, Natalie, she's going to be talking about the third step, when God seems silent.
Yeah, I think even in that, what Chase was saying about us, just our kind of assumption about everything in the dark, that everything's bigger and scarier and always negative in the dark. And when we're in those seasons that are really low or silent or seasons of waiting, I feel like for myself at least, doubts are the first thing that start to come up. Was I ever really saved to begin with? Was that God ever real that ever spoke to me? And we start to allow those doubts to grow so large or morph into these monsters that we think are going to, I get to the place where I'm going, was I even saved to begin with? Like, will God forgive me for even having these doubts on the other side? But I think when we bring those doubts to light, when we bring them to him in prayer, then he has the ability to show his goodness through them, to answer them with wisdom and with his promises to bring us comfort. And we miss out on that when we hide those things, when we don't bring them to light and we don't give him permission to be God in those situations. And so just a little side note on that. But my third point on what to do in silence and waiting is to be willing to leave it at the feet of Jesus. Obviously, much easier said than done, right? When you actually have something to surrender, surrendering is the hardest thing that you could ever have to do. When we have nothing to surrender, man, it sounds so easy. You're like, yeah, God, I surrender all to you. It's literally nothing, but I do. And I'm sure when things get harder, I'll totally surrender to you. But then when reality hits, when the situations actually happen, when it's difficult to even begin talking about them, or when the feelings, the emotions that we're experiencing seem all-consuming, the idea of surrendering something to God is exhausting. And the thought that you may have to do it day in and out because there's no end on our season of waiting is sometimes worse than the idea of doing a marathon, that it's going to take so much effort day after day, and I'm not going to see the end in sight, and you're asking me to do this again. And so I think in that, I need a motivation to go to Jesus, to leave things at his feet. There was this really good quote that I found from John Piper that says, "Waiting on the Lord is the opposite of running ahead of the Lord, and it is the opposite of bailing out on the Lord. It's staying at your appointed place while he says stay." And I think in that, we sometimes forget that it's even an appointed place that we're at when we're in waiting. We feel like the appointed place is the destination, but this part in between can't be appointed by him. But just know that so many of the people that have influenced you, your leaders that have poured into you, oftentimes did it in a season of waiting, in a season of silence, not out of an emotional overflow that they just felt they needed to be so spirit-led to pour out this truth on you, but out of obedience and faithfulness to what God's called them to the truth and what they've been called to, even out of feeling nothing, having it come completely from God and not from their own wisdom or anything like that. And in that means that the same is true for you, that it's not a pause where you sit and wait and do nothing, and it's not a moment to run and do something out of panic, that you need to make yourself busy so you stop thinking about the way that you feel. The rest of this quote says that waiting is not impetuous. Impetuous means that idea of careless rushing around, just running to the next thing, trying to busy ourselves or find our own next appointed thing instead of just waiting for him. And it's also not despairing. Lacking in hope is the meaning of despairing. And I think for me, we need to come to a place of hope, that we would come to the feet of Jesus with a hope in mind. And that hope that we find is the entire book of Romans, I think. The definition of our salvation, the explanation of his grace and his goodness to us. And so when I'm in those seasons where I feel like God hasn't spoken to me for a while, or I haven't felt anything, or emotions aren't there, when I'm worshiping, I feel like I'm a fraud. Everyone has to know. I'm raising my hands, but emotionally I feel nothing. And in those moments, I need to run to Romans, to that truth, that his salvation and his grace and his mercy for us is new, and his salvation isn't contingent on my emotions. He's a God who's powerful enough to save me regardless of how I feel. And in that, I can start to build hope on what we're actually created to build hope on. If you want to turn with me over to Romans, all the way in your New Testament, we're going to be in chapter 8. And we're going to start in verse 16. It's talking about being heirs with Christ, becoming children that are to inherit his glory and his goodness, to be a part of what a child of God is entitled to. Give you guys another second to get there. Romans 8:16. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. Cool, we all like that. We're children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs is a great thing. We get something out of this. There's an inheritance on the other side. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, but provided that we suffer with him in order that we may be glorified with him. And that's the part of the passage that we would rather throw out, that there might be suffering involved. And for some, it may be physical, present, painful suffering, disease that continues for the rest of your life, chronic depression because of chemical imbalances that you battle for the rest of your life. And for some of us, it may be the experience of suffering through waiting. Sometimes that is just as emotionally difficult, to wait through silence and feel like God isn't present or isn't giving you even crumbs to run on of his goodness or his presence or his spirit. And we don't like that. We want to say that the Christian life, the experience of being a child of God, is full of abundance, and that's true, but it's abundance within that suffering that he promises to be present. And so as we go through suffering, this is what Paul says, verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealings of the sons of God. That eager longing that all of creation has, that it's waiting for that moment when this world is redeemed, when we are revealed as his children. It's a crazy thing to think that creation all around us doesn't have thought or choice. God created it to be waiting for that moment, that all of it is falling apart, that it's going to ruin in this time, that all of it goes to chaos, and in that moment it's all redeemed and restored, and all of creation is waiting for that, and it's found in us being redeemed and revealed on the other side of that. And I think that's something that we have to lean in to learn to be as eagerly awaiting that hope of salvation as the rest of creation is. If you jump down to verse 23, says, and not only creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the spirits, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this we hope we were saved. Now hope is not what is seen. No, I can do this. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So for me, it's going back to Romans. It's to that understanding of what my hope is, that I was dead in my sins and unable to save myself, and that Christ came and paid the perfect price for my life, redeemed me when I couldn't save myself, and that salvation is secure, and that it means redemption in every area in eternity, and that's what I can worship him for, that if he's big enough to buy my salvation, to give his life for the whole world, then that's a God that I want to leave all of my crap at his feet at. That we surrender in light of his victory in this life and learn to build hope for that future life. That even maybe these seasons of waiting and silence, if the only purpose that God has for you in them is that you would learn to build hope on something beyond this life, that's huge. A lot of times in those seasons, our biggest hope is that we would just feel emotional again, that we could just have a really high worship time, and that's all that we're hoping for. But I think God longs for us to have something more than that, to have a hope that's fixed on something eternal, and that's something that we can grasp now. And in that we're willing to lay everything at his feet and then be found faithful worshipers, faithful servants of Christ. Coming back to this Christmas story of the Israelites waiting for 400 years in silence. They did a lot of things, made walls, built temples, rushing around trying to do that, fixing God's will or finding God's will. And then there's Mary, who was just a kid who was found faithful, that an angel came down and said, You get to be the one that brings the Messiah. And her first response to that is worship. And I love that. I aspire to be like that, that I could just faithfully serve with what I know of God right now. And that when the time comes, if he chooses to use me for something, that I'm prepared, that I'm ready, and he would call me a faithful servant. And within that story, after Jesus is born, they go to the temple to dedicate him, and there's a prophetess there who is waiting for him and praying for him, and she gets to bless him. And there's a man, Simeon, sitting in the temple who's waited his entire life in the temple for that day when Jesus came. That out of however many thousands of Israelites there were through those 400 years, there were 3 that were faithful, at least, that the Bible talks about. And I aspire to be one of those that walks through whatever the season may be, silence or waiting or suffering or hard things, but I'm still faithful to God and his promises and his truth. And the difference is the Israelites, they had this much of the Bible about, and they were going off of that. We have this entire thing that we get to cling to. Mine's a little extra big, but we have this entire thing to cling to of those truths of his promises. And specifically, I go back to those truths about salvation that we find in Romans, about his grace, his compassion, and his salvation for us. And with those 3 steps, I think we're well on our way to walking through those hard seasons in the right way.
David ends the psalm with saying this, "But I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your deliverance. I will sing to the Lord because he has treated me generously." David's saying this before he's even granted victory, because he knows of who God is. I think there's so many times when I was a younger kid, I felt lost. I felt abandoned. I felt like my parents forgot about me, but it was only till I grew up, it was only till I got to know my parents more, that even though I didn't see them or even though I didn't hear them, I knew they still loved me. That if I wouldn't be able to hear from them for a while, I knew I could just call them up at any time. They would love me. That they still love me, even when I don't see them, even when I don't hear them. I know I have my parents' love for me. And how much more do we have God's love for us? We may be able to hear him. We might not be able to see him. But if we know him, we know he's a good father. We know he loves us abundantly. So when we feel like God is silent, when we feel like he's absent, we're to be honest with him. Not putting on a mask, but saying, "God, I don't feel like I've heard from you for a while. I don't feel like I've seen you move." We are to rely on him. Continue to go into prayer. Continue to see everything in light of him. And then finally, we're to leave it at the feet of Jesus. Give it over to him. And not be anxiously thinking about it over and over. So let's pray. God, you continue to use us even when we don't get what you're doing. Even when we don't see you or hear from you, Father, you love us so much. God, I pray in these periods, in these seasons of silence, Lord, may we continue to just be at your feet. Continue to talk to you, to be with you, to trust you. Lord, may we grow so that we may know that you love us, even in these periods of silence. So God, may you receive all the glory. In your name we pray. Amen.